For the next half hour, the time is late 1864, the place is Kenosha, Wisconsin, and you are the Kenosha Ladies Aid Society and their guests. I am very pleased to introduce to you one of the outstanding women of Wisconsin, a former First Lady of our state, a great lady who has served as an agent for the Western Sanitary Commission. She has visited most of the soldiers' hospitals and camps up and down the Mississippi River, bringing relief to our soldiers in the form of clothing, food, and words of encouragement. She has become known to thousands of our brave men and boys as the Wisconsin Angel. She is here today to tell us about her experiences and to urge us all to continue to send aid, encouragement, and hope to our boys in blue. Ladies and gentlemen, let me present Mrs. Lewis P. Harvey.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dear friends, I am so very grateful to the Kenosha Ladies Aid Society for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. And may I say, ladies, how pleased I am to see how many of you have induced your husbands to join us. Gentlemen, I promise it will be worth your while. Ladies, I know that you have worked very hard, scraping lint, making bandages, knitting socks and gloves, sewing shirts and uniforms and blankets, growing fruits and vegetables to send to our soldiers, and making all sorts of wonderful preserves out of those fruits and vegetables. But I hope that by sharing with you today my experiences, it will encourage you to maintain and perhaps even increase your efforts on behalf of our beloved Wisconsin men and boys. I know that it is customary for the guest speaker to say a few words about themselves, and so I will say a few words about how it is I came to be in this place at this time. Like many families that came to the Wisconsin territory, mine came from the East, from New York. My father chose to settle in a place which was then called Southport. You have since changed the name to Kenosha. I don't know why. In any case, we were fortunate. My father was and is a prosperous farmer. And perhaps because I am the oldest of 6 girls, I decided to become a teacher. And I was able to secure my first position at Southport Academy. And it was there that I met my future husband, Mr. Lewis P. Harvey. He was the principal of the school. I hope you will not impute any scandal to our falling in love and marrying. He was, after all, my superior. But we did marry. And soon after, we moved from Southport to Clinton Junction, which is in Rock County, and from thence to Chaupier. My husband opened a grain mill and a mercantile, but he had long been interested in politics. He was one of the youngest members of the convention which drafted our state constitution. And as we all know, Wisconsin became a state in 1848. As you know, he also served 2 terms in the state Senate. In 59, we had to move to Madison because he was elected the Secretary of State. And then in 1861, he was elected the governor of our fair state, as the politicians say. His inauguration was in January of 1862. And early in April of 1862, as many of you will remember, and perhaps cannot forget, was the great Battle of Shiloh. There were 3 Wisconsin regiments involved, not the least of which being the valiant 18th, who only a week before had been training in Milwaukee. The weather was such that they could not drill properly. Some of the men later told my husband that the first time they heard the order to load and fire was in the face of the enemy. From the beginning of the war, even before my husband became governor, we had both been very concerned about the welfare of Wisconsin soldiers and their families, and we worked in support of them. So when the news came of the many casualties in the Wisconsin regiments, my husband felt that it was his duty to gather supplies and bring what comfort and aid he could to our Wisconsin soldiers. He collected blankets, clothing, food, medicine. He even induced some of our doctors to accompany him. He and part of his staff traveled down the Mississippi River, making stops in Cairo and Mound City, Illinois, and Paducah, Kentucky, finally making their way to Savannah, Tennessee, which is very near the site of the battle. It was later told to me that it would have moved a heart of stone to see these interviews between the governor and the soldiers as they lay on their cots. I think they knew instinctively that this was not mere formality with him, but that he was genuinely concerned about them. The time came for him to begin his return trip. It was April 19th, Pittsburgh landing on the Tennessee River. It was 10 o'clock at night. It was dark. It was raining. My husband and his party were to transfer from one steamboat to another. But as the other boat approached, it appeared that the two would collide. My husband instinctively stepped backwards and fell into the water. And even though his companions tried valiantly to rescue him, they could not. He was pulled under by the current, under a flatboat, in fact, and was drowned. I was in Madison, in the capital, working for the relief of soldiers' families when I was approached by my brother-in-law, Dr. Nathaniel Sawyer, and Adjutant General Gaylord, who informed me that he had heard some disturbing rumors about the governor, and would I accompany them to the boarding house where the governor and I were staying at that time. Now, perhaps some of you have found yourselves in a similar situation. There is bad news, and your friends do not want to tell you in public. But finally, I could bear it no longer, and I said, "Please tell me if he is dead." And I knew by what they did not say that I had lost him. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all those of you who sent condolences at that time. They were very much appreciated. I loved my husband, and I mourned him. I am not ashamed to say I became somewhat unsettled in my mind for a time. I think my friends became concerned about me. They began to try to interest me in all sorts of endeavors to distract me from my grief. But finally, I had to ask myself what my duties in life would be. And I remembered something that my husband had written to me in his last telegram. He said, "Yesterday was the day of my life. Thank God for the impulse that brought me here. I am well and have done more good by coming than I can well tell you." And I thought of how abruptly, how quickly, how soon his work had come to an end. And so I decided that I would try to continue his work supporting Wisconsin soldiers. I immediately began to see what was the best way to do this. As Providence would have it, my husband's successor, as you know, Governor Salomon, appointed me sanitary agent for the state of Wisconsin. That was September 10th. By September 29th, I found myself in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I knew what my duties were as a sanitary agent. I was to see to the welfare of the soldiers, see to it that they were provided with various supplies. I was to inspect the hospitals for cleanliness, see to it that the surgeons were apt in their duties. I was to keep the governor informed of my work and my whereabouts, and provide him with a list of the names of the sick, the wounded, and the dead. But I was completely unprepared for what awaited me at Cape Girardeau. There are times when the meaning of words seems to fade away. So completely does our language fail to express the reality. I was never so keenly aware of this as when trying to depict the suffering that I witnessed, both physical and mental. To lie extended upon a narrow cot day by day, slowly perishing from disease, surrounded by the dead and dying, far from friends and home, with no hope of seeing either again on earth, with every sensibility tortured by sight and sound, requires more courage, greater power of endurance and firmness of purpose to meet and bear uncomplainingly than to meet the armed foe, even in the heat and excitement of battle. At Cape Girardeau, the sick and wounded were being brought in from the swamps by the returning regiments and upriver on boats to makeshift hospitals, mere sheds filled with cots side by side, so close one could scarcely pass between them. There were 100 men there suffering from every disease that flesh is heir to. Pneumonia, typhoid, and camp fever, and that fearful scourge of the southern swamps and rivers, chronic diarrhea, occupied every bed. The surgeon there said to me, "There is nothing else here. There I see pneumonia, and on that cot fever, and on that cot another disease, and I see nothing else. You had best stay away. The air is full of contagion, and contagion and sympathy go not well together." Their only nurses were the convalescent patients who went pale and tottering through the rooms, doing, it is true, all that they could, but sometimes they would just get sick again. There was one surgeon there, one surgeon for the entire regiment. The first assistant had gone home, and the second assistant was himself sick. As I passed through these hot, uncomfortable, unventilated, infected, wretched, unclean rooms, a hand reached out, clutched my dress. Another caught my shawl and kissed it. One soldier placed my hand to his fevered cheek. Another cried out in wild delirium, "I want to go home. I want to go home. Lady, lady, take me away in your chariot. Take me away." Grown men cried like children. Some of them were only boys. "Oh, my mother," they would say, "my mother. Can I go home, Mrs. Harvey?" On these cots, I failed to see disease and delirium and looming death. I saw the sons and brothers, husbands and fathers of anxious weeping ones at home, and as such, I cared for them, both the living and the dead. Upon my arrival, I found that the body of a dead soldier had lain for hours unattended to, because those in charge were afraid to touch him because he had died of disease. But I could not be afraid. This was some mother's son. So I asked for some bandages, and with my own hands, I bound up his face, and encouraged by this, the burial party coffined the body and removed it from that place. I said that one of my duties was to provide the governor with a list of the names of the dead. To him, these were names on a list. But I could put a face to every name, even if I had never actually seen them. William Spencer, Company G, Appleton. Charles Kiltz, Company K, Eagle, Wisconsin. George T. War, Company I, Menominee Falls, Waukesha County. The lists went on and on. At Cape Girardeau and at every camp and hospital that I visited, it was my responsibility to find our Wisconsin soldiers and to make a record of each man, his name, commanding officer, company and regiment, and his condition, so that if he were no longer fit for service, he might receive a certificate of disability. This would allow him to gain a furlough or a discharge so that he could go home. At Cape Girardeau, I requested certificates of disability from the surgeon there for a number of men in the hospital. These were deemed imperfect by the medical authorities at St. Louis and returned to us, so that the surgeon had to make out new papers before these men could have leave to go home. Many of these men, as I feared while awaiting these papers, received their final discharge from all earthly service. Time and again, the papers that were needed for furloughs and discharges were disapproved by the medical directors and returned to us. The surgeon in charge of the hospital at Helena said that he had a number of times made out certificates of disability for some of the men in his hospital and sent them to the medical director, a young major in the regular army, who invariably disapproved them. The surgeon said he had even allowed some of the soldiers to travel to present their papers in person, only to have this young major reject their requests, reprimand the poor fellows soundly, and order them back. The surgeon told me with tears in his eyes that some of these men never returned, for, brokenhearted, they had lain down by the side of the road and died. And if you think this impossible, you must know that I have found men who have lain on the same cot for 5 months. They are too sick to fight, but the army will not let them go home, and they are not being paid the entire time. Who would not lose heart? I said that it was my responsibility to help Wisconsin soldiers. But I soon found that in order to help them, I had to do for as many as possible. In the hospital at Helena, there were between 14 and 1,500 patients. I lay awake all one night asking myself, could I visit them all? But I decided that this was the best way to help our Wisconsin soldiers, and so I would do it. Our boys in blue are all alike, dear to me. God bless them all. No one state can claim them exclusively, but they are the pride of everyone. States' rights are not recognized anymore by sanitary agents than they are by the government. Colonel Allen, the medical inspector of General Grant's army, said that if I would go through the entire hospital and make a list, the name, company, and regiment of every man that I deemed would never again be fit for service, of course, I could not judge of disease, that he would act upon these cases at once. There was no one else to do this. I only took the names of cripples, consumptives, feeble old men over 60 years, and boys between the ages of 15 and 18. I do not remember the exact number, but they were hundreds. It took 3 long days of hard work from early morning until late at night. And by the time I was finished, I was very well acquainted with the surgeons, the medical inspector, and the medical director. In fact, I stayed there for 10 days, doing whatever work my hands could find to do. And when I was finished, I said, gentlemen, you are pleased to say that I have been of some assistance to you. I have certainly tried to be of help to these poor unfortunates here without partiality. I now ask that those from my own state be attended to first. And Colonel Allen said, Madam, bring forth your cases, and they shall be attended to at once. So you see, in this way, I was best able to help Wisconsin soldiers by trying to help as many as possible. I also visited camps and hospitals at Memphis, Corinth, Jackson, LaGrange, and at Vicksburg. I spoke with General Grant, who greeted me with all possible attention. In fact, we spoke twice, and he promised that I should have everything that I asked for. In this way, I was able to obtain from him an order stating that all those suffering from chronic diarrhea should be sent to northern hospitals. He also approved a plan for emptying the convalescent camps by immediately discharging all those who would never again be fit for service. Now, I put this plan to the test immediately at Memphis, where I found 100 men in a convalescent camp at Fort Pickering. These men could not have lived if they were not sent north. They were not only sick, but needy, as they had not been paid. I was able to secure transport for them at no expense and a clean change of clothing from the Western Sanitary Commission. I deemed the experiment a success, for of all the men released from that camp, only 5 died. 7 were discharged, and all the rest returned to service. While I was at Vicksburg, I also visited the camp of the 25th, about 2 miles outside of town. Those who were well were in good spirits, but it would have broken one's heart to see the sick and worn out. Poor fellows, they lay in the dirt, dirty, ragged, with no appetite. And if they did have any appetite, they had nothing to eat but hardtack and bacon, which lay piled in one corner of the tent in the dirt. I asked, did they not think they might like a clean change of clothing? And they said, oh yes, Mrs. Harvey, but we can draw none until we get to Memphis. I asked if there was something that they would like to eat. And one young boy said, if I could have some green stewed apples, they would taste good. I said, baked apples? He said, no, stewed apples, with a look and a sigh that said more plainly than words that he knew he could not have them. I hastened home. I gathered up old bed quilts and comforters, pillows with nice clean cases, socks, drawers, shirts, towels, some good dried beef, sweetbread and butter, Catawba bitters, and 2 quarts of green stewed apples. I hurried back. I got there about supper time. They were not expecting me. I took the blankets out of their tents and gave them a good shaking. And then I put the rubber ones down first, and then the bed quilts and comforters and pillows. I asked them to wash for dinner, but I had forgotten to bring a wash basin. So they had to pour water from their canteens onto the towels and use those. And while they were changing, I went to the surgeon's and borrowed some dishes. I divided up the beef and the apples, and the bread and butter was all prepared. You should have seen them eat it. This tastes good. Oh, how good this is. I can eat this. I only wish that all those who had sent all these good things could have seen in what I did that night. I tell you, tears would come in spite of every effort as I went from tent to tent. Tears of gratitude that I was permitted to be the almoner of Northern Bounty. I would not trade the memory of their grateful faces or their heartfelt God bless yous for anything in this world. I could fill hours with such stories, but I do not have time to tell them, and you do not have time to listen. I had long felt through much of my work that we must change the military regulation which required sick soldiers to stay in Southern hospitals when, by bringing them north, our bracing atmosphere might restore them to health. I knew that the heads of departments did not want hospitals established so far from Army lines, and I could not understand why. It made perfect sense to me. I approached our Senator Howe, proposing a petition for the establishment of hospitals in Wisconsin for our own soldiers. In short order, we had over 8,000 signatures. It was further proposed that I should take the petition to Washington myself, for it was felt that by sending it first by this officer and then by another, that the message would grow cold and lose the flavor of truth before reaching the deciding power. Whenever you have some object of importance to gain, it is always best to go at once to the highest authority, in temporal as in spiritual matters. Be your own petitioner. Officiate at your own altar. Be your own priest. And so I went to Washington and entered the White House to speak with President Lincoln, not filled with fear and trembling, but fully conscious of the righteousness of my mission. When I first saw the president, he was seated, his head bowed, his chin resting on his breast, and in his hand was a letter which I had just sent in. He looked up and said, "Mrs. Harvey." And I hastened forward and said, "Yes, and I am very glad to see you, Mr. President." So much for Republican presentation and ceremony. He took my hand and hoped that I was well, but there was no smile of welcome upon his face. It was rather the stern look of the judge who had already decided against me. I found his face peculiar. Bone, muscle, nerve, vein, also plainly seen, with deep lines of care and thought around his mouth and eyes. The word justice came into my mind as though I could read it there on his face. I mean the extended sense of the word, which comprehends the practice of every virtue which reason prescribes and society should expect. The debt that we owe to God, to man, to ourselves, when paid, is but a simple act of justice, a duty performed. This attribute seemed to be the source of Mr. Lincoln's strength. When he had finished reading my letter, he looked up at me with a great deal of sad severity and said, "Madam, this notion of Northern hospitals has been talked of a great deal, and I thought the matter settled. Obviously not. What do you have to say about it?" Only this, Mr. President, that many of our soldiers now in the South must have Northern air or die. There are thousands of graves all along our southern rivers and in the swamps for which the government is responsible ignorantly, undoubtedly, but this ignorance must not be allowed to continue. If you will permit these men to come north, you will have 10 men, where you have 1 now. And he said, yes, I understand you, but if they are permitted to go north, they will desert. Where is the difference? And I said, dead men cannot fight, and they may not desert. And so the argument ran on, I defending my position, the president attacking it, until we both realized that we had reached a deadlock. And he handed my letter back to me and suggested that I should go speak to the Secretary of War. Now, as I was making my way to the War Department, I found these words written on the back of my letter. It said, "Admit Mrs. Harvey at once. Listen to what she says. She is a lady of intelligence and talks sense. A. Lincoln." I was not displeased with this introduction. And so I made my way to see Mr. Stanton, the Secretary of War, who informed me that he had just sent the Surgeon General to New Orleans on a tour of hospital inspection. Well, I knew that this would practically have no effect on the current circumstances. And I said, the fact of the matter is that the medical authorities know that the heads of departments do not want hospitals established so far from Army lines, and they report accordingly. I wish this could be overturned. Can nothing be done? Apparently nothing could be done until the Surgeon General had returned. So I took my leave of him. But I was not at all disappointed with my day's efforts. I felt that I had made a deep impression on both men, and I could afford to wait to see the results of these interviews. I awoke the next day full of hope. But when I returned to the White House, no smile greeted me. After a moment, the president said, "Well," with an odd contortion of the face that I had never seen on anyone else. And after a moment, I said, "Well," and he looked at me a little astonished, I fancied, and said, "Have you nothing more to say?" "Nothing, Mr. President, until you tell me your decision. You bade me come this morning. Have you decided?" "No, madam, but I find this notion of northern hospitals to be a great humbug, and I am tired of hearing about it. I regret to add a feather's weight to your already overwhelming care and responsibility. I would rather have stayed at home." And with a kind of half smile, he said, "I wish you had." "Nothing would have given me greater pleasure, Mr. President, but a keen sense of duty to this government and a deep regard for your honor and position made me come. The people cannot understand why their sons and brothers and husbands and fathers are left to die when, with proper care, they might grow strong again and do good service for their country. Many on their cots, faint, sick, and dying, have said, we would gladly do more. I know that the majority of them would be well again if they were permitted to go north. I know because I was sick amongst them myself last spring, surrounded by every comfort, with the best of care and determined to get well. And yet I grew weaker day by day till my friends took me north, where I recovered entirely, simply by breathing the northern air. Well, the expression on Mr. Lincoln's face changed many times, though he never took his eyes from me. And then suddenly every muscle in his face seemed to contract and then suddenly expand. And he said, "You assume to know more than I do," and closed his mouth as though he never expected to open it again. I was hurt and thought the tears would come. But after a moment, I said, "You must pardon me, Mr. President. I mean no disrespect. But it is because I do know what you do not know that I come to you. If you knew what I know and had not ordered what I asked for, I would know that an appeal to you would be in vain. But I cannot believe that the people have trusted you for naught. The question only is whether you believe me or not. If you believe me, you will give me hospitals. If you do not, then you will not." Then he snapped, "You assume to know more than the surgeons do." And I said, "Mr. President, I come to you from no casual tour of inspection, passing rapidly through the general hospitals with a cigar in my mouth and a rattan in my hand, talking to the surgeon in charge about the price of cotton and abusing our generals for not knowing and performing their duties better, and then finally coming out into the open air and drawing a deep breath as though just having escaped suffocation, and complacently saying, 'Well, you seem to have a fine hospital here. The boys seem to be well taken care of. A bit more attention to ventilation is perhaps desirable. It is not thus that I have visited hospitals, but from early morning until late at night, I have visited hospitals all up and down the Mississippi River, from Quincy to Vicksburg, and I come to you from the cots of men who have died, who might have lived had you permitted it. This is very hard to say, but it is nonetheless true. The president scowled at me a bit, though he had not much more to say. I was given to understand that if I would return the next day at noon, I would have my answer. I awoke the next morning depressed, convinced that I had failed in my mission for the soldiers. I was anxious and impatient. I kept looking at my watch, thinking that 12 o'clock would never come. Finally, it did come. And I went to the White House only to be told that the president was in a cabinet meeting. After 3 long hours, during which I became more and more certain of defeat, the president came into the room where I had been waiting. He walked towards me, rubbing his hands together and saying, "My dear Mrs. Harvey, I'm so very sorry to have kept you waiting. I only wish to tell you that an order granting hospitals in your state has been issued for some 24 hours." I could not speak. I was so completely unprepared for it. I wept for joy. When I could speak, I said, "God bless you. I thank you in the name of thousands who will bless you for this act." And after a moment, he said, "Suppose you would have been mad if I had said no." And I said, "No, Mr. President, I would not have been angry." He said, "Well, I think I acted wisely in any case." I said, "Don't you ever get angry? I know a little lady not very unlike you who gets mad sometimes." But I said, "No, Mr. President, I never lose my temper when I have some object of importance to gain. To get angry would only weaken my influence and destroy my cause." And then he looked at me directly and said, "This hospital I shall name for you." I was deeply touched and very grateful for his consideration. But my thoughts were elsewhere. And I said, "If you would not deem the request indelicate, I would that you would name this hospital for Mr. Harvey." And he said, "Yes, it shall be so ordered if that is what you desire. I honored your husband and mourned his loss." And then we talked on for a while. And then he looked at me from under his brows and said, "You think me almost handsome now, don't you?" His face then beamed with such kindness and was lighted by such a pleasant smile that very impulsively I said, "You are perfectly lovely to me now, Mr. President." And he blushed and laughed most heartily. As I arose to go, he put out his hand, that hand in which there is so much power and little beauty. And he held mine, clasped and covered in his own. A silent prayer went up from my heart. "God bless you, Abraham Lincoln." And we said our goodbyes, and I was gone. Thus ended one of the most interesting interviews of my life. And now, though our work is far from over, we have 3 hospitals established in Wisconsin at Madison, Milwaukee, and Prairie du Chien. Our soldiers continue to be tended to by the work of the US and Western sanitary commissions and their agents. I say, may God bless our dear, brave Wisconsin men and boys, their families, and those who so tirelessly care for them. I thank you.